Well, thank you very much for having me here today. So as David says, I'm based in the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics, but by training I'm actually a computer scientist, and both Anna Korhonen, who's my co-worker and co-presenter, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because of family emergency, we both work in an area of computer science called artificial intelligence, and in particular a sub-area of that looks at getting computers to make sense of human languages, which we call natural languages. So I'll be using the term natural language processing quite a lot through the talk, and it just means getting computers to do intelligent things to understand human languages. So today's talk is something of a kind of smorgasbord. I'm going to be presenting, not in depth, but a kind of a la carte menu, if you like, of different projects that we've been involved with in the area of health that try to do intelligent things with human language. But in the sort of theme of big data, I thought I'd just sort of put up one slide to sort of set the context. And I really believe that trying to do something with natural language, trying to get deep understanding by computers of human languages is the next great challenge that we face. As we all know, high throughput methods in biomedicine have produced enormous amounts of data. By and large, this is quite structured. But there's a vast amount of health data that it seems to me exists only in unstructured natural language format. And I put up some examples here, some of which some data types I've worked with, others I haven't. There's the biomedical literature, as exemplified by the abstracts that we all see in Medline. Lab notebooks, clinical notes, diagnostic reports, clinical trials data, but less formal types of health data, perhaps ones that we wouldn't normally consider, things like wiki pages, web data, and voice of the patient, which I will be talking about a little bit later, as exemplified by social media data. And the question is, well, how do we ingest these into computer systems, and what are the issues around that? There's a statistic that I've seen quoted many times from IBM, and one which I've tried to drill down to get to the source of, but I actually can't find a basis for this evidence. So I'm going to quote it here. Believe it or don't. But they say that 90% of the world's data did not exist 2 years ago. And I think that just sort of, in a sense, it exemplifies the big data issue for us. If you can find the source of this, the source data for this quote, I'd be really happy if you could send it to me. So natural language processing is going to be the cornerstone for actually doing something with all this large data. Something less in the realms of speculation, but it sounds like science fiction, is something that happened, I think last year, was in a game show called Jeopardy. And did anybody come across this? Has anybody seen Jeopardy or heard this particular news? Yeah. It was a sort of, I don't know if you go back 20, 30 years, there was a moment when a chess computer beat Garry Kasparov. Well, there was a sort of similar moment that happened last year when a computer beat human contestants in a game show called Jeopardy. And the nature of this program is that the questions are not just simple yes, no, who, where, what questions, but they actually require some level of inferencing. And the system that won the game show was IBM's system called Watson. And why is this relevant for our conversation here? Well, Watson obviously has been produced by a commercial entity, and they want to make use of it in applications where it can be potentially useful. And one of these is in health. And it's actually one of the first applications for this system has been in collaboration with Mayo Clinic to try to do cohort selection for oncology data. So it's actually I believe, quite relevant, and this represents probably the state of the art in our technology. So I'd like to very briefly run through 5 case studies that I have been involved with. I wasn't involved with the IBM system, but I'm going to very briefly run through all of these and perhaps focusing a little bit on the first one, because that's sort of close to the interests, I believe, of this audience. So the first case study is in global health alerting, and this was work I did for about 8 years while I was a PI in Japan. And we built a system, a fully functional research prototype that surveillanced the open news media, specifically the news media you can get hold of on the web, and tried to provide an alerting capability for infectious disease outbreaks. So I'm going to be flashing through all of this, and forgive me, I won't typically bring up citations, but you can find them in the first slide of each case study. I don't think I really need to motivate the importance of global health alerting, and it was particularly obvious, I think, recently in 2014. But just to say that we were looking at news as a signal source, and we were operating largely within the scope of the international health regulations, so specifically looking for events that cross country borders or ones which were particularly severe. This was the system that we eventually came up with, so it's the really the user interface. And you'll see that the result of mining the web is actually shown in a biogeographic interface here. And what this shows is typically human, animal, plant events, disease events, relating to chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear causes. As you would expect, on such a system, of course you have the biogeographic map, which you can manipulate in various ways. It's a Google Map interface. But there's also the underlying data, the aggregated data you can play with, a watchboard if you had a login, and an underlying database that you could have downloaded. And we actually worked with the global public health community in the form of G7 governments plus the World Health Organization. And a part of this data was actually sent to this community for their own analysis. So I don't want to get into the deep nature of the technology, but just to give you a sort of sense for some of the challenges that we face. So when we're processing human languages, as has been commented on before, the data is vast, and this is typically not what you would associate with big data, but in terms of volume, but in terms of veracity, the speed with which you need to process it is actually part of big data, and this can increase by an order of magnitude if you have a pandemic event like swine flu. So from this, you're typically trying to take this data into your system and then condense that down to 4 or 5 alerts per day, which is something a typical human analyst would be happy to deal with in their morning mailbox. So that's the sort of scale down issue. On top of this, we have the issue of multilinguality. If you're actually surveillancing across the world's news media, you'll be looking at multiple languages. Typically, news will be reported in a local language, which will be the most timely source of information. And you'll be having to overcome various forms of ambiguity. So for humans, it's very obvious, by and large, how ambiguity should be resolved. But for computers, it's not. And if we just take a place name like Camden, how to actually find out which Camden in the real world that is a big issue for a computer. Similarly, out of vocabulary phrases, by and large, diseases are well, names of diseases are well documented, but you will get new forms coming up, and these have to be handled intelligently. Otherwise, you end up waking people at 2 o'clock in the morning with embarrassing false positives. So all of these things need to be dealt with. How long do I have?
Only about another
5 minutes, okay. So we were working, as I say, with the G7 consortium, and one of the benefits of this was that we could actually have access to some gold standard data, and we, Global Public Health in France actually provided, well, in-house, they looked at the outputs of our system and another 6 systems and compared it to their own human analysts. And you'll see just a summary here. So detection rates ranging from 31 to 38% for individual systems, including Biocaster, and F1, which is a harmonic mean between recall and precision, ranging from 6% to 27%. Giving a kind of first insight really into the capabilities of technology for H5N1. The very good news was that we were sort of typically alerting about 10 days earlier than World Health Organization. And we did separate studies compared to ProMed Mail and got another about 4 days earlier than them. So I'm going to move very quickly on to the other projects. We've worked not only with news data, we've worked with the biomedical literature. The last 2 years I was on a fellowship working at the EBI down the road in Hinxton, looking at getting computers to understand phenotypes and how these are typically described in the scientific literature. You'll see here very obvious mutation between different, the wild type and the mutated forms of eyes in different model organisms. But how to describe that, how humans describe that, can be very varied. And getting a computer to actually to capture this and to code it is not a trivial issue. If we can do lots of fancy things. Not least we can try to bridge the gap between some of the data across model organisms and humans, which is something we've done preliminary work on with Damien Smedley's group at the Sanger. So voice of the patient is something I loosely describe social media data as the opportunity to really understand and get behind the voice of the patient. Social media data, in this case Twitter data, we're looking at just really trying to understand whether it can be useful in some application. Here, what we're looking at is modeling influenza, seasonal influenza, through people's avoidance behaviors and how they describe those avoidance behaviors. And we found quite good correlation with natural language and seasonal influenza in this way, but better correlation just using simple symptom keywords and names of different forms of influenza. So this is CDC's gold standard laboratory data in the dark blue. Our best curve is in the light blue, and I think we get about a 0.99 correlation, which is extremely good. However, that's just using keywords, and what we would like to do is to really try to code this social media data so that we can do other applications as well. And the two applications I'm currently trying to take forwards are around infectious diseases and atherosclerotic reaction profiles. So this gives a little bit of a feeling for that. If we could take a Twitter message, then our in back throat, we can do the linguistic analysis on it, and then we can transform from the linguistic to a conceptual representation, which the biomedical informatics community, the ontology community would recognize. Then we're in a much better state to try to ingest this data and incorporate it into existing analysis pipelines. Okay. So Anna Korhonen is also PI on a number of projects, which I will just very briefly mention. One has been CRAB, Chemical Cancer Risk Assessment, and what she's been doing here is working with cancer research community to try to provide ways to make the systematic review process less painful. So that's Crab, and I'm sure if you have questions, she would be delighted to hear from you. A new project that's just kicked off, again MRC funded, is critical hypothesis generation from the literature. And this builds on Donald Swanson's observation that by connecting the dots between different published studies, you can come up with interesting hypotheses that can hopefully narrow down the space for experimentation. And his famous case study on this was Reynolds syndrome and fish oil. So by connecting the dots between Reynolds syndrome and protein and fish oil in two different places, I think he came up with a positive connection there. So this is something Anna's trying to help to automate in this particular project. Okay, I think I'm going to finish up. I would just reiterate, I think NLP is not a panacea, of course it's not, but it's a useful technology. We're interested in working cross-discipline to help to put this into action, to encode unstructured big data. And finally, I just want to thank our partners in various areas, and if you're interested, we put out a new web portal like that. Thank you very much.
Great.